Alexander Shelepin is a man who is rarely mentioned, but who in the 1960s was one of the most dangerous figures in the Soviet government. He did not appear on television screens like Brezhnev or Khrushchev, but people whispered behind his back because he knew too much. And he was gaining power too quickly. Shelepin was born into a simple family, but from a young age he showed a tough character and excellent organizational skills. His path to the top began with the Komsomol. At the age of 33, he became the first secretary of the Central Committee of the All-Union Leninist Young Communist League, in essence the most important person among all the youth of the USSR. But he had no intention of stopping there. He was quickly noticed by those at the top, and within a few years, Shelepin was appointed head of the KGB. It was 1958. He was only 40 years old at the time. For the first time in the history of the KGB, such a young man was at its helm. Many thought he was too inexperienced for such a machine, but they were greatly mistaken. From the very beginning, Shelepin began to act harshly and quickly, as if he had known what to do for a long time. He did not wait for the system to accept him. He began to break it down and rebuild it to suit himself. The first thing he did was carry out mass purges. During the first 2 years under Shelepin, more than 200 generals left the KGB. This was not a coincidence or a matter of age. He removed those who were associated with the old elites and did not inspire his trust. He replaced them with his own people, young, ambitious, and personally loyal. He was convinced that the security forces should not just maintain order, but also govern the country. In addition, under Shelepin, the KGB became more secretive and unaccountable. He limited contact with the press and even with other agencies. At meetings, he did not say anything unnecessary and did not allow others to do so either. Under him, the entire KGB system became a structure with no leaks. Silence, discipline, fear. He knew how to eliminate enemies not only physically, but also politically. If someone got in the way, documents, testimonies, and suspicions would appear. Within a month, such a person would lose their position, and then all traces of them would disappear. It was a subtle, almost silent method, but effective. Alexander Shelepin had many nicknames, but one of the most memorable was the Second Stalin. This nickname was not given to him by journalists or enemies. It was given to him by those who knew him personally, who worked with him in the KGB and in the highest circles of power. This was because his management style and view of power were reminiscent of what the USSR had already experienced once before, under Joseph Stalin. Shelepin did not seek to be liked. He did not smile in public and did not arrange friendly meetings. Within the apparatus, he was feared. He did not raise his voice, but after his short phrases, people lost their jobs, and for a long time, he did not threaten, but if he knew something, that knowledge worked like a sentence. In the KGB, he was called Iron Shurik, not jokingly, with respect and fear, behind his back. Because he was cold and cruel, he had no favorites. He could fire one of his people without explanation if he saw that they were starting to think too independently. His decisions were not discussed, they were simply carried out. Shelepin believed that after Khrushchev's thaw, the country had become weak. He wanted to restore order, discipline, and fear to the USSR. He openly and behind the scenes promoted the idea of a firm hand. He said that the country once again needed strong leadership, one that would not be afraid to act harshly, even against its own people. He did not simply support surveillance. He personally gave permission to monitor ministers, party officials, and even members of the Central Committee. He built a system in which all key information flows went only to him. Even department heads who previously reported directly to the Central Committee could no longer bypass him. He knew that control is power, and real power is knowing who is saying what about whom. Under Shelepin's leadership, the KGB became more than just a special service. It was his personal instrument of influence. He forced the KGB to deal not only with external enemies, but also with internal surveillance of the elite. And not just in words, he personally controlled the collection of information on the country's top leaders. It is reliably known that Shelepin secretly compiled files on Brezhnev, Kosygin, and other key figures. He kept all these materials to himself without passing them on to the Central Committee. This meant one thing. He was collecting compromising information. He was preparing a database to use as a weapon at the right moment. He believed that this was the only way to keep the country from falling apart. He kept these materials to himself, and this was his real instrument of power. After all, if you have information, you have control. It was at this point that many in the Politburo and the Central Committee began to see him as a dangerous man, a man who could go further, who could use his files not just for control, but to take the top seat in the country. And in the USSR at that time, people still remembered well how Stalin first became second and then the only one. At the age of 45, Shelepin already controlled not only the KGB, but also the Ministry of Internal Affairs, and he also had influence over party appointments. This meant that no minister, no head of a republic could take office without his consent. He held in his hands not only the security apparatus, but also the party career ladder itself. And all this while Brezhnev was still alive. But most importantly, Shelepin had personal access to tens of thousands of agents, including those who secretly monitored ministers, members of the Central Committee, and even members of the Politburo. This made him almost omnipotent. He knew who was meeting with whom, who was calling whom, and what was said at closed banquets, and he quietly collected this information in folders. At first glance, he remained in the shadows, but behind the scenes, everyone knew that if Shelepin had his eye on you, your career could end at any moment. He was not just an ambitious official, he was a strategist. He saw how, after Stalin's death, the country began to fall apart. Khrushchev was conducting experiments, the elite was fighting among themselves, and discipline was declining. Shelepin decided that if things continued this way, the USSR would simply collapse. This meant it was time to take power into his own hands, and so he began to act. He was building his model of future power, an alternative one, bypassing party channels. This model was to be based on three forces: the KGB, the army, and the Komsomol. The KGB was already under his control, the army through connections in the Ministry of Defense, and the Komsomol. He himself had previously headed it, and his people remained there. It was a triangle that he intended to turn into a real vertical of power. But he did everything secretly. Officially, he worked in party structures, attended meetings, and wrote reports. Behind the scenes, he was building a system where important decisions were made not in the Central Committee, but in a small circle of his trusted associates. He created a reserve cadre of people whom he could promote to key positions at any moment. These were not party members, but security officials and young functionaries ideologically loyal to him. But most importantly, Shelepin had a personal plan for an emergency seizure of power. According to information that later surfaced in the archives, he prepared a scenario for action in the event of a political crisis. If chaos broke out in the country, or if a struggle began in the Politburo, he was to mobilize the security forces and arrest key members of the USSR leadership. In other words, a coup. Bloodless but lightning fast. Such a plan was not written down on paper. It was a personal agreement with several people in the KGB and the Ministry of Internal Affairs. At the right moment, they were to block access to buildings, cut off communications, and isolate the top brass. In return, they were promised posts in the new leadership. Shelepin was not going to wait to be appointed. He was preparing a scenario in which the country would wake up to a new order, one in which the main force would not be party chatter, but discipline, intelligence, and fear. Shelepin had no random allies. He had been building his team for years, from those he trusted personally. They were former Komsomol members, KGB officers, and party officials who were considered the new wave from the 1950s to the 1960s. Many owed their careers to him. He helped them rise and expected loyalty in return. But it was they who betrayed him. One of his main allies was Nikolai Shelikov, then Minister of Internal Affairs of Ukraine, and later the all-powerful head of the USSR Ministry of Internal Affairs. He and Shelepin had gone through the Komsomol school together, risen through the ranks together, and seemed to be working towards the same goal. Shelikov actively supported the idea of strengthening the role of the security forces and, at the right moment, could have become part of the coup. But as soon as the wind changed, Shelikov was the first to turn his back on Shelepin. He betrayed all their conversations and plans to Brezhnev in exchange for guarantees, and soon received the post of Minister of Internal Affairs. In other words, he betrayed his ally for the sake of his career. He did not fight, he decided to survive, and at the same time he eliminated his former ally from the game. The situation with the Komsomol was even worse. It was Shelepin's brainchild. He personally raised the VLKSM, created cadres, and led young people to power, and he believed that the Komsomol would become his reliable support. But when rumors began to circulate that Shelepin was to be removed, it was precisely from within the Komsomol that denunciations began to arrive. His own protégés, those whom he had promoted, began to distance themselves from him in panic so as not to be caught up in the fallout themselves. There was no one in the top leadership who would risk standing up for him either. Many feared that if he was not stopped, he would become too powerful and then begin purges against them. Therefore, when the pressure began, all his allies left one by one. He was left alone, without a team, without support. And in Soviet politics that was fatal. But in the USSR it was not customary to cause public scandals, especially within the Politburo. If it was necessary to remove someone dangerous, everything was done quickly, quietly, and without unnecessary fuss. This was the case with Alexander Shelepin. He was not criticized publicly, nor was he summoned for questioning. One morning it was simply over. One day, and he was no longer anyone. Shelepin did not know until the very last moment that an operation was being prepared against him. He still attended meetings, prepared proposals, and communicated with the party elite. But behind his back, negotiations were already underway. Brezhnev and his entourage understood that they could not delay. If Shelepin was given time, he could strike first. Therefore, they decided to act immediately. At a meeting of the Presidium of the Central Committee, he was handed the decision: immediate dismissal from all posts. No discussion, no arguments. Formally, it was due to health reasons, as was often the case in the USSR. But in reality, it was much harsher. He was immediately forbidden from appearing in Moscow without the permission of the Central Committee. In other words, he was expelled from the political center of the country, and for a politician of his caliber, that was the end. But the main event did not take place at the meeting, but immediately afterwards. Within 24 hours, personnel purges took place throughout the KGB structure. In just 48 hours, 36 people directly associated with Shelepin were removed. His people were removed from key posts, from the archives, from security, from human resources, from analytics. Everything that could remind people of his influence was purged. It was a real neutralization operation. No arrests, but complete removal. He no longer had any leverage. Not in the KGB, not in the Ministry of Internal Affairs, not in the party. Those who had recently followed him were now signing papers for his removal. The authorities pretended that he had never existed. Shelepin found himself isolated, both politically and physically. He could not contact anyone, his phones were disconnected, and his movements were monitored. He was not under investigation, but he was not free either. He was given to understand, either keep quiet or disappear for good. When Shelepin was removed from all his posts, he did not protest. He did not cause a scandal. He did not try to fight back. He simply disappeared from public life, as if he had never existed. And that was the most unexpected thing. The man who controlled the KGB, the Ministry of Internal Affairs, and party appointments, suddenly fell silent. For several more years, he was formally listed as a member of Soviet structures in the so-called Party State Control Committee, but this was no longer a position of power. He was given an honorary exile so as not to humiliate him too much, but also to prevent him from ever returning. Gradually, he was no longer invited even to formal events. No interviews were published, and he was not mentioned in the newspapers. Shelepin spent the last 20 years of his life in almost complete obscurity. He lived in Moscow, but under constant unofficial surveillance. His movements were tracked, and his circle of friends was limited. He did not make a single serious public appearance after 1975. He did not write memoirs or make loud assessments of current events. He understood that any activity could end badly, and the system that he himself had once built was now working against him. Even his family felt the consequences. His son, a promising scientist and official, was removed from all serious positions. People openly said, "The Shelepin surname is too dangerous." In the USSR, the children of disgraced leaders were not imprisoned, but they were simply not allowed anywhere, neither in science nor in politics. Shelepin lived out his life in the shadows. He did not live in poverty, but he did not shine either. In the Kremlin, they tried not to mention his name aloud. It was erased from official history. Not a single line was written in textbooks about his role in the KGB, his plans, or his influence. It would seem that after Shelepin was removed, isolated, and erased from politics, there was nothing to fear. He kept quiet, stayed out of things, gave no interviews, made no attempts to return. But the fear of him did not go away. Even years later, when his health deteriorated and his influence disappeared, people continued to fear him. The authorities knew that Shelepin knew too much. He had worked with secret documents for decades, kept compromising information on the elite, and personally read the files on everyone who was now sitting in the Central Committee and the Council of Ministers. He could reveal who had betrayed whom, who was an agent, and who was involved in behind-the-scenes games. And most importantly, he may have had copies of these materials. Rumors still circulated in the KGB and Central Committee archives that Shelepin had his own black folder containing particularly sensitive information. Even if he never showed it, the very fact that such data existed was frightening. In 1983, following an internal order, the KGB began purging all personal files related to Shelepin. This was a rare case. Not only official documents were destroyed, but all papers, letters, photographs, and records related to him personally. This was done only in exceptional cases, when a person could cause harm even after death. In addition, it is known that in the 1980s, Shelepin tried several times to give interviews. Not publicly, but for closed archives, about his work in the KGB, about Brezhnev, about internal conflicts. But none of these interviews were published. Moreover, some of the recordings disappeared without a trace from the archives. No one could say where they had gone. This suggests that even decades later, the authorities were afraid that if the truth came out, it could spark a scandal capable of destroying the entire legend of the stability of the Brezhnev era. So who was Alexander Shelepin? A ruthless apparatchik, a clever strategist who dreamed of a new system, or the last person who wanted to return the Iron Fist to power in the USSR? His story is not just a biography. It is a mirror of everything that Soviet power was in the years after Stalin.